What makes a cheap shoe? And how do you spot one of these on the shelf? Well, I'm hoping that by the end of this video, you'll be able to tell me. I find that in most cases, cheap shoes aren't really worth the investment, mainly because they don't look particularly great, they wear out really quickly, and not to mention, they rub your feet to bits most of the time. I see loads of guys walking around with shoes that are under about £30 on the feet, most of whom I can see have got blisters, and I would know because that's happened to me. I recently bought these super cheap shoes on one of my style challenges, and they absolutely ripped my feet to bits. I was left with 4 blisters after barely any time wearing these. So how do you avoid these mistakes? I'm gonna make you a shoe detective, and I'm gonna point out some of the things that you can look for. A glaringly obvious sign that your shoes are really cheap is they're not even made out of proper leather, and instead they're made out of varying types of faux leather. A popular choice is polyurethane, also known as the PU leather, which is essentially just plastic. And you can tell that a shoe is made of pleather because often it has a bit more of a shiny finish. And also the surface, you get a bit of like a rubbery feel. And when you scrape across it, listen to this. You don't get that with leather. It's because there's a very slight tackiness to the surface. Also, this stuff bends like no tomorrow, and it's typically very thin. In some cases at the really low end of things, like significantly worse than this, you'll see the outer layer actually peeling off if you touch it too much, often splitting apart, not looking good. The second way to spot a cheap shoe is to look for a poor quality rubber sole. Now, unlike other people that I've seen online who would put this as their #1 factor, you know, if the shoe has a rubber sole, it's cheap. But when it comes to rubber soles, it really varies so much. If you want to be one of those guys that will only ever wear leather-soled shoes, then be my guest and then go and break your neck next time it rains. Rubber really does have a purpose and a place if it's good rubber. In all truth, the rubber sole in this pair of shoes actually aren't terribly bad. I've seen a lot worse at this sort of price compared to these. One giveaway sign that the rubber sole is terrible is that the bottom layer is incredibly thin. In a lot of cases with really cheap shoes, when you're walking, you can feel everything that's on the surface of the pavement. And you'll be able to literally get your finger and easily bend and flex the bottom to the extent where the insole you'll see is moving up and down. These formal shoes here, for instance, which I've had for substantially longer, have a much more solid rubber sole on. It's a lot thicker and certainly much more rigid. And also this is completely solid throughout. A lot of the really low-end shoes, typically more the formal shoes rather than the trainers, you'll find have a hollow sole. So they'll have an outer edge of rubber and then a gap before the actual base of the shoe, which means that you're going to be eroding through that in no time at all. Telling the difference between a decent quality rubber sole and a cheaper quality rubber sole, if you're not that experienced, can be quite difficult. I'd suggest when you're going shopping for shoes, check a few places, have a feel of the base. I'm fortunate because I worked in a shoe shop for 4 years, so I'm familiar with the variety in terms of the quality of the sole. But rubber can be really useful, like I said before, for places where it's not very sunny. But in general, in terms of, you know, maximum durability and performance, leather soles like this one are probably optimal. I mean, what I've done with this one is I've actually had these custom made with the sort of rubber dimples on the bottom, which gives me a bit more grip whilst retaining the structure of the leather sole. Then again, when you're talking about leather soles, although you are getting higher quality, it comes at a higher cost compared to rubber. The third sign of a cheap pair of shoes comes down to the laces. Cheap shoes come with cheap laces. My friend Frederick from the Style Your Life YouTube channel had a bit of an experience with cheap laces in February. He came over, we were going to go to the Menfluential conference in America, and as we head out to the airport, he ties his shoelaces on his cheap shoes and rips the laces off. The laces were so low quality that he literally ripped it in half. And obviously, no one probably wants to be in that situation. And I know you can buy laces separately if you want to for shoes. But really, when you look at, you know, companies making shoes for that lower price point, they cut costs everywhere. But when you look at the laces and you feel like they could easily rip apart, then that's a warning sign to you. It's just another area of expense that you don't need. You want your shoes to last well. I've had these trainers for well over 3 years now, and the laces are fine. They're a little bit ragged, but they've lasted very well overall. This can be important when you've got a pair of shoes that are in a very specific colour like these, where it's difficult to get the laces to match. For number 4, we're going back down to the bottom of the shoe. We are looking at the sole again, but this time not necessarily the material. We need to look at how the sole is actually fixed onto the shoe, because a sign of a cheap shoe is that this sole is actually being glued on. These are easy to spot because this type of shoe normally has no stitching around the perimeter, has no stitching anywhere on the bottom of the shoe, and will often have slight glue marks around the edge, just like with these. Don't know if you can quite see that on the camera, but it is just about noticeable with the naked eye. Now, the risk that you take with glued footwear is the potential that this could rip off from the top, because this shoe is made with 2 parts literally just bonded together with some sort of adhesive. And if you ever played football on the school playground, you will have seen stuff like this. I remember when I was a kid, everyone used to rip their shoe soles off completely. They'd kick the floor and then the sole would peel away and then the shoe was completely ruined. Even with trainers, you can get trainers that actually have a stitched sole, which this proves much more resilient when it comes to overall durability. It's going to take a hell of a lot to part the main part of the shoe with the sole for this one. And also in some cases, having a stitched sole can help with waterproofing the shoe. Nothing worse than stepping in a puddle and having your toes completely soaked. So have a look, see if it's got this stitching. Make sure it's real stitching, not fake stitching like lots of brands are putting on their shoes. And then obviously, if you've got a leather-soled shoe with some form of welt on it, then this is going to be the most optimal again. But again, this is primarily restricted to a little bit more formal shoes. And the 5th and final thing to look for to identify a cheap pair of shoes is this bit in the middle, the lining. And this thing really is the killer with footwear. Because if you've got a pair of shoes with a really uncomfortable lining, your feet are fucked. No one buys a pair of shoes to have your feet bleeding all day in them. Now, there are different approaches when it comes to the linings of the shoes. In most cases, a leather lining is optimal for comfort. This one has primarily leather around the edges, and then you've got cork as the base for this one. This one has the objective to soak up moisture, but you've got plenty of other options with shoes, especially formal shoes, where it's leather throughout the inside. Typically, the cheaper end shoes will have a fabric lining instead, with some sort of foamy cushion inside. There's a couple of big problems when it comes to this stuff. Firstly, this fabric can be really harsh on the skin of your feet. If your foot is moving at all in the shoe, you're going to get some sort of erosion. These disintegrate really quickly and perform terribly in wet weather. And also, you're probably going to be left with stinking, sweating feet. So let's recap then. Cheap shoes typically have faux leather. You want to go for at least some sort of real leather instead. Normally performs better. Cheap shoes have a poor quality rubber sole. Depending on what type of shoe and what function you want, just try and go for either a better quality rubber sole or a leather sole if you can afford it. Or you can have one like I had, where you've got the rubber bits actually built into it for extra grip in the leather sole. You want to make sure you've got laces that don't rip out. Be aware of the glued/cemented sole, and also look out for a cheap lining that could ruin your feet. So now you know how to spot a cheap shoe. I want to know what budget you have when it comes to buying a new pair of shoes. Press the eye in the corner of the screen right now, and I've got a few different price bracket options, because for future videos, I want to know what sort of budgets you guys have to play with. Personally, for me, I will normally not spend under £50 on any shoes, because I find the value proposition to not be worth it in terms of comfort or durability, and you end up spending more in the long run and looking worse at the same time. And let me know in the comment section below, what's your worst experience with shoes? I want to hear some funny stories. I've got some funny stories of my own. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you press the like button. And if you want to see more similar videos just like this one on what to wear and how to style your hair, then make sure you press the round subscribe icon just to this side here. And then I've got 2 more fun videos, hopefully about shoes, just below me down there as well. So go and watch one of them next, and I'll see you on the next one.